The Montana winter had no mercy for those who traveled unprepared. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the platform of Pinewood Valley's small train station until the weathered wooden boards creaked under its weight. The last train of the day had departed nearly 3 hours ago, its black smoke long since swallowed by the gathering storm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Brennan, Maggie to the few who knew her well, sat alone on a bench beneath the station's meager awning. 3 small figures huddled against her like birds seeking warmth. Her gloved hands, worn thin at the fingertips, clutched a letter so tightly the paper had begun to tear at its creases. She had memorized every word, every promise written in an elegant hand that spoke of a new beginning, a fresh start for a widow with 3 young children in a place where nobody knew their story. "Mama," whispered the youngest. "Grace," her voice, muffled against the folds of Maggie's coat. "Is he coming?" Maggie pressed her lips to the child's forehead, unable to answer. Lucy, her eldest at 12, sat straight-backed and solemn, eyes fixed on the empty road that disappeared into swirling white. Henry, sandwiched between his sisters, had fallen into fitful sleep, his small body trembling despite the layers Maggie had wrapped him in. The station master approached, lanterns swinging from his gnarled hand, casting elongated shadows across the snow. "Ma'am," he said, voice gruff with pity, "ain't nobody coming tonight. Town's 3 miles north. Inn's likely full, but Widow Parker sometimes takes in strays for $1 a night." Maggie nodded, dignity holding her spine straight, though her heart felt crushed beneath its weight. "Thank you," she said, though she knew her purse held barely enough for tomorrow's meal, let alone shelter. The station master lingered, shifted his weight. "Expecting family?" A bitter smile pulled at her lips. "A husband. Apparently, he's had a change of heart." The letter had been clear. Gerald Pierce, a successful merchant in Pinewood Valley, sought a wife, preferably a widow of good standing, who understood the demands of running a household. What Maggie had not mentioned in her careful responses was that she came with 3 children. She had planned to explain upon arrival, certain that once he saw them, bright, well-mannered, and desperate for a father's guidance, he would welcome them all. But the telegram that had been waiting at the station told a different story. 2 terse sentences: arrangement terminated, children unacceptable. The station master cleared his throat. "Storm's getting worse. You ought to..." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the howling wind. A large draft horse emerged from the white void, pulling a sturdy wagon. The driver, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a heavy coat, reined to a stop before the platform. "Station Master Hobbs," the man called out, his voice deep but not unkind. "Mrs. Parker sent word you might have passengers stranded." "Just the one," Hobbs replied, then corrected, "Well, 4, counting the little ones." The driver's gaze found. Maggie lingered on the children. Something unreadable crossed his features, not displeasure, but something more complex. He dismounted with surprising grace for a man of his size, boots crunching through fresh snow as he approached. "Thomas Fletcher," he said simply, removing a glove to offer his hand. "I've got room at my place. It's warm and there's food." Maggie hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "We can't pay much. Not asking for payment." His eyes were the color of coffee, steady and clear. "Nobody should be out in this, least of all children." Lucy tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering urgently, "Mama, Henry's getting colder." Thomas Fletcher's gaze dropped to the boy's pale face. Without another word, he reached down and scooped Henry into his arms with such gentle confidence that the child barely stirred. "The wagon's got blankets. We should go before it gets worse." Maggie gathered Grace into her arms while Lucy followed close behind. The letter from Gerald Pierce forgotten on the bench. already disappearing beneath a fresh layer of snow. Pinewood Valley had been Thomas Fletcher's home for all of his 38 years. The small Montana town, nestled between tall pines and taller mountains, had shaped him as surely as he had shaped the wood that came from its forests. His hands bore the calluses of a man who knew both the lumber mill and the plow, who could fashion a cabinet as skillfully as he could break a wild horse. The wagon creaked along the snow-covered road, Thomas's broad back to the wind as he guided his horse toward home. In the bed behind him, Maggie Brennan sat with her children beneath a pile of wool blankets, their faces pale smudges in the gathering darkness. He'd stolen glances at them, the woman with copper-colored hair escaping from her practical bonnet, the solemn girl who watched him with calculating eyes, the sleeping boy, and the tiny girl who peeked out from her mother's embrace with curious wonder. His sister, Eleanor, would have plenty to say about this. Ellie had managed his household since Sarah died 3 years ago, had watched him retreat into silence and work while the rooms of the house his own hands had built echoed with emptiness. She had tried, God knows, to coax him back to living, introducing eligible women from nearby towns, arranging Sunday dinners that always somehow included a widowed cousin or a school teacher newly arrived. Thomas had endured these attempts with the same quiet patience he showed a nervous colt. But he had never brought a woman home himself, certainly not one with 3 children in tow. The wagon turned off the main road onto a narrower path that wound through a stand of pines. The snow fell less heavily here, the trees providing some shelter from the worst of the storm. As they emerged from the trees, Thomas's homestead came into view. A sturdy 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch, smoke rising from the stone chimney. A barn stood to one side, and beyond it, fields now dormant under winter's blanket stretched toward distant woods. "This is yours?" The girl, Lucy, he'd heard her mother call her, asked, the first words she'd spoken directly to him. Thomas nodded. "Built it myself. Started with just the barn, added the house after I married." "Where's your wife?" she asked bluntly, earning a quick, sharp "Lucy" from her mother. "It's all right," Thomas said, pulling the wagon to a stop before the house. She passed, fever, 3 summers back. Lucy's face softened slightly. "Our pa died too, in the factory fire." Thomas met Maggie's eyes briefly. A shared understanding passed between them, the weight of loss recognized without need for words. Then the front door of the house swung open, and Eleanor Fletcher appeared, wrapped in a shawl, her expression shifting from relief to confusion as she took in the unexpected passengers. "Thomas?" Uncertainty made her voice higher than usual. "We weren't expecting—" "Stranded at the station," Thomas said simply, lifting Henry from the wagon. "The boy's half frozen. Can you get the fire built up?" Eleanor blinked, then nodded, practicality overriding questions for the moment. "Bring him in. I'll heat some broth." Thomas carried Henry toward the house, feeling the boy stir against his chest. Behind him, Maggie helped Grace down from the wagon while Lucy gathered their meager bags. "Just till the storm passes," Thomas heard Maggie assure her daughter in a whisper. "Then we'll figure something out." The house welcomed them with warmth and the scent of pine and cooking. Eleanor had kept the place well. Gleaming wood floors, simple but comfortable furniture, curtains at the windows that Sarah had sewn in what seemed another lifetime. Thomas laid Henry on the sofa nearest the fire, watching as color slowly returned to the boy's cheeks. "He'll be fine," he told Maggie, who hovered anxiously. "Just needed warming up." Eleanor appeared with steaming mugs of broth, her movements efficient as she distributed them, though her eyes kept darting to Thomas with unspoken questions. Grace accepted her mug with 2 hands and a shy "thank you," which seemed to soften something in Eleanor's expression. "I'm Eleanor Fletcher," she said, addressing Maggie, "Thomas's sister. "Margaret Brennan," Maggie replied, "and my children, Lucy, Henry, and Grace. We're very grateful for your hospitality." "Unexpected as it is," Eleanor added, with a pointed look at her brother. Thomas ignored the hint, instead focusing on stoking the fire higher. "They'll stay in the East Room," he said. "It's big enough for all four." "That's Sarah's sewing room," Eleanor objected, then immediately flushed at her own tactlessness. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken by Henry's stirring. The boy sat up, blinking in confusion at his unfamiliar surroundings. His eyes, a startling blue against his pale face, found Thomas and widened. "Are you a giant?" he asked, with the directness of 9-year-olds everywhere. Despite himself, Thomas felt a smile tug at his mouth. "Just tall," he answered. "How are you feeling?" "Hungry," Henry admitted, and something in the room eased, the tension giving way to the simple necessities of the moment. Eleanor, practicality winning out over reservation, announced, "There's stew enough for everyone. Lucy, would you help me set the table?" As the others moved toward the kitchen, Thomas found himself alone with Maggie for a moment. She stood by the fire, the light playing across features that showed both strength and exhaustion in equal measure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mr. Fletcher," she began, "I need to explain." "No need," he interrupted gently. "Whatever brought you here, it's your business." She studied him as if searching for some hidden motive. "We won't impose long. Once the storm clears." "Where will you go?" he asked. The question hung between them, unanswered. In the silence, the wind howled around the eaves of the house that suddenly seemed less empty than it had in years. Morning revealed a world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep in places, drifts piled against the north side of the house like frozen waves. The storm had passed but left behind a crystalline stillness, the sun reflecting blindingly off-white. The fields. Thomas stood on the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, watching as Henry and Grace tentatively ventured into the snow. Their delight at its depth, "Look, Mama, I'm disappearing," was impossible not to smile at. Behind him, he heard the door open and close softly. "They can't stay," Eleanor said without preamble, coming to stand beside him. Her voice was low enough that the children wouldn't hear. "People will talk." "Let them," Thomas replied, sipping his coffee. "Be serious, Thomas. A woman with 3 children appearing suddenly at your doorstep. You know how Pinewood Valley gossips." He turned to look at his sister. Ellie had been 16 when their parents died, leaving Thomas, barely 20 himself, to raise her. He'd put off his own plans, his own marriage to Sarah, to ensure Ellie finished school, had opportunities. And when Sarah died childless after years of hoping, it was Ellie who had moved back to keep his house, and though neither acknowledged it aloud, to ensure he wasn't left entirely alone. "They needed help," he said simply. "That's all there is." "Do it," Eleanor sighed. "You don't even know their story. For all you know, she could be a mother trying to keep her family together," Thomas finished. "That's enough for me to know." Inside the house, they could hear Maggie moving about the kitchen. She had woken before either of them, somehow, intuiting where everything was kept, and had breakfast nearly prepared by the time Eleanor came downstairs. It was a small courtesy, but Thomas recognized it for what it was: pride, the need to earn one's keep even when charity was offered freely. "The roads won't be passable for days," Thomas continued. "They stay until then, at least." Eleanor's face softened slightly. "You always were too kind for your own good," she murmured, then added, "I'll go into town once the path is clear. Samuel will have gotten a shipment by then, and we'll need more flour if we're feeding 3 growing children." Thomas nodded, grateful for his sister's practicality, even in disagreement. "Thank you, Ellie." She squeezed his arm, then went back inside. Thomas remained on the porch, watching as Lucy emerged from the house to join her siblings. Unlike the younger two, who had surrendered completely to the joy of the snow, Lucy moved carefully, her eyes frequently scanning her surroundings, returning often to check on her mother through the window. She reminded Thomas of himself at that age. After his parents died, he'd grown up too quickly, shouldering responsibilities no child should have to bear. "Your sister doesn't approve of us being here," Maggie said, stepping onto the porch. She had spoken so quietly that Thomas startled slightly. "Ellie worries," he replied, not bothering to deny it. "It's what she does." Maggie nodded, watching her children. "She's right to be concerned. You know nothing about us." Thomas turned to face her fully. In daylight, he could see that Maggie Brennan was perhaps 30, with a scattering of freckles, across a nose that had seen its share of sun. Her hair, neatly pinned now, was indeed the rich copper he'd glimpsed last night, and her eyes were a clear, steady green. She wore a simple dress that had been mended multiple times, with careful, nearly invisible stitches. "I know you came to Pinewood Valley expecting something that didn't happen," he said. "I know your children are well-mannered, and that you yourself are too proud to ask for help, but smart enough to accept it when offered." A flush colored her cheeks. "Mr. Fletcher." "Thomas," he corrected. "Thomas," she amended. "I should explain why we were at that station. I answered an advertisement. Mr. Gerald Pierce sought a wife to help manage his household. We corresponded for several months, and he sent train tickets for us to join him." Her voice grew tight. "What I failed to make clear was that I have 3 children. Upon learning this, he declined the arrangement." Thomas felt a surge of anger toward this unknown man. "He left you stranded, with children, in a snowstorm." Maggie's chin lifted slightly. "He sent a telegram, very proper. I simply didn't receive it until we'd already arrived." "That's..." Thomas bit back several words unsuitable for mixed company. "I know Gerald Pierce. His store's the only competition for Samuel Wilson's General Goods. He's not well liked, but I wouldn't have thought him capable of such callousness." "People can surprise you," Maggie said softly, a wealth of hard-earned wisdom in the simple statement. In the yard, Grace had fallen face first into a snowdrift and emerged laughing, her face a mask of white. Henry was attempting to construct what might generously be called a snow fort, while Lucy, despite her initial reserve, had begun to help, packing snow into more stable shapes with efficient movements. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked. Maggie sighed. "Find work. Mrs. Parker at the boarding house might need help with cleaning, or perhaps the school needs an assistant. I was a teacher before I married." "And the children? They're mine," she said quickly, a protective edge entering her voice. "We stay together." Thomas recognized the fear beneath her words, the terror of separation that haunted every widowed parent with limited means. "Of course," he said. "I only meant they'll need schooling, care during the day." Maggie relaxed slightly. "Lucy's old enough to mind the younger ones when needed. She's had to grow up quickly since her father died." Thomas nodded, watching as Lucy showed Henry how to better pack his snow. "She reminds me of my sister at that age, too serious for her years." A small smile touched Maggie's lips. "Lucy was always my solemn one, even as a baby. Henry's my dreamer, head always in the clouds. And Grace..." Her expression softened further. "Grace finds joy in everything, somehow." "You've done well." "By them," Thomas said, and meant it. Maggie's eyes met his, surprise and something like gratitude flickering in their depths. "Thank you for saying that. Not everyone sees it that way." Before Thomas could respond, a shout from the yard drew their attention. Henry had apparently decided that his snow fort could be improved by climbing onto the lower branches of a nearby pine to gather greenery for decoration, The boy now dangled precariously, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the snow-slick bark. Thomas moved without thinking, crossing the yard in long strides. "Stay still, Henry," he called. "I'm coming." Henry froze, looking down with wide eyes. "I just wanted pine branches," he explained, his voice trembling slightly. "Good idea," Thomas said calmly, positioning himself beneath the boy. "But next time, ask for help with the climbing part. Now, can you lower yourself down a bit? I'll catch you." Henry bit his lip, then nodded, slowly releasing his grip on the branch above. He slid down, then dropped the last few feet into Thomas's waiting arms with a small oof. Thomas set him down carefully, checking for injuries. Finding none, he said, "You're a brave climber, but trees in winter can be tricky. The bark gets slippery under all that snow." Henry nodded solemnly. "I didn't think of that." "Tell you what," Thomas said, "I've got some pine boughs already cut in the woodshed for keeping the well from freezing over. We can use some of those for your fort if you'd like." Henry's face lit up. "Really? Really? And I might have some ideas for making that fort more sturdy if you're interested." "Yes, please!" Henry grabbed Thomas's hand without hesitation, tugging him toward the woodshed with newfound trust. Thomas glanced back to see Maggie watching. Them, an expression on her face he couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and a deeper, more complicated emotion that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. Eleanor Fletcher returned from town 3 days later with flour, sugar, and a wagon full of gossip. She found Thomas in the barn, repairing a bridle, while Henry watched with fascination, peppering him with questions that would have tested the patience of a saint. Thomas, to Eleanor's surprise, answered each one thoughtfully, occasionally letting the boy hold tools or demonstrating a technique with careful hands. "Samuel Wilson sends his regards," Eleanor announced, hanging her coat on a peg near the door. "And his curiosity about our guests. Seems word has spread about the woman Gerald Pierce, abandoned at the station." Thomas's hands stilled briefly. "That didn't take long." "It's Pinewood Valley," Eleanor replied with a shrug. "Mrs. Hargrove saw you bring them home. She told Mrs. Bennett, who told Reverend Collins, who mentioned it to Samuel while buying nails." Henry looked up, suddenly alert to the undercurrents of adult conversation. "Are people talking about us? About Mama?" Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a glance. "People always talk, Henry," Thomas said gently. "Doesn't mean you need to listen." The boy considered this. "At our old place, after Pa died, people talked too. They said Mama couldn't manage alone, that we should be sent to homes where we'd be properly raised, but Mama wouldn't let them split us up." The matter-of-fact way he related this made something in Thomas's chest ache. "Your mother's doing a fine job raising you," he said firmly. Henry beamed. "That's what I told them, but they didn't listen to me because I'm just a kid." Eleanor's expression had softened, listening to the exchange. She knelt before Henry, brushing a smudge of dirt from his cheek with unexpected tenderness. "Well, I think being just a kid means you see things more clearly sometimes. Now why don't you go tell your mother and sisters I've brought cinnamon? Maybe we could persuade them to help make some cookies." Henry needed no further encouragement, darting out of the barn with the boundless energy of childhood. When he was gone, Eleanor turned to her brother. "You're getting attached," she said quietly. Thomas returned to his work, avoiding her gaze. "They're good children. And their mother, what about her?" His hands moved methodically over the leather. "She's a good woman in a difficult situation. Nothing more to it than that." Eleanor made a skeptical sound. "Samuel mentioned there might be a position opening at the school. The assistant teacher, Miss Abernathy, is marrying in spring and moving to Helena." Thomas nodded slowly. "Maggie mentioned she was a teacher before." "Ooh, Mrs. Brennan," Eleanor corrected. emphasizing the formal address, would need someone to recommend her to the school board. "I'll speak to Reverend Collins," Thomas said decisively. "He chairs the board." Eleanor studied her brother's face. "And the children? While she's teaching. Lucy's old enough to help after school. Before that." He hesitated. "We could manage. Between us." "Thomas," Eleanor's voice grew gentle, "what exactly are you proposing here?" He set down the bridle, finally meeting his sister's eyes. "I don't know, Ellie. I just know they need help, and we have room, and this house has been too quiet for too long." Eleanor was silent for a moment, then sighed. "The town will talk even more if they—" "Stay. Let them," Thomas said again, with more conviction this time. "We've weathered worse." Eleanor touched his arm briefly. "Just be careful, for all our sakes." As she left the barn, Thomas returned to his work, but his mind kept drifting to the sounds that now filled his house. Grace's delighted giggle, Henry's constant questions, Lucy's quiet, watchful presence, and Maggie's voice, growing more confident each day, as if gradually allowing herself to believe in this temporary sanctuary. Temporary, he reminded himself, though something in him rebelled against the word, but he knew better than most how quickly happiness could be snatched away, how tenuous security could be. Better not to hope for too much, to expect permanence, where none was promised. Outside, he could hear Henry recounting his barn adventures to his sisters, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "And Thomas says I can help him with the horses tomorrow if Mama says it's all right." Thomas smiled, despite himself. Perhaps some hope was unavoidable after all. The first whispers reached Maggie a week later at the general store. She had ventured into town with Eleanor, who had reluctantly agreed it was time to introduce her to Pinewood Valley properly. The women had left the children with Thomas, who was teaching Henry and Grace how to repair a broken sled while Lucy organized Thomas's chaotic bookshelf, a task she'd appointed herself without prompting. Samuel Wilson's general store served as the beating heart of Pinewood Valley. Its wide plank floors had been worn smooth by decades of boots, and shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, laden with everything from canned peaches to hunting rifles. The bell above the door announced their arrival with a cheerful jingle that belied the sudden hush that fell over the gathered customers. Maggie kept her chin high as she followed Eleanor through the store, acutely aware of the conversations that halted mid-sentence and the eyes that tracked her movement. A cluster of women near the fabric section whispered behind gloved hands, their gazes darting between Maggie and Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "Mrs. Fletcher," Samuel Wilson called from behind the counter, his voice warm. "And you must be Mrs. Brennan. Welcome to Pinewood Valley." Samuel was a wiry man with kind eyes and prematurely silver hair. He wiped his hands on his apron as he approached, offering one to Maggie. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Maggie replied, accepting his handshake. "I appreciate the welcome." "Sam, please," he insisted. "Any friend of the Fletchers is a friend of mine." From the corner of her eye, Maggie noticed a woman in an expensive wool coat frown disapprovingly. Eleanor noticed too, her spine stiffening. "We need flour, coffee, and something for the children," Eleanor announced, pointedly loud enough
for everyone to hear.
"Mrs. Brennan's son Henry is particularly fond of peppermint sticks." Samuel's eyes crinkled with understanding. "I just received a fresh supply. Let me show you." As they moved deeper into the store, a voice carried clearly from the fabric section. "I heard Pierce took one look at all those children and sent her packing. Can you imagine hiding something like that in letters?" "It's beautiful here," Maggie said softly, "even with the gossip." Eleanor glanced at her. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Eleanor considered this. "Someone weaker, perhaps. Someone looking for rescue." Maggie adjusted, her grip on her packages. "I've learned rescue rarely comes when you're waiting for it. Sometimes you have to rescue yourself." And yet, Eleanor pointed out, you were waiting at that station. I was hoping, Maggie corrected. There's a difference. They had reached the edge of town, where the road forked, one path leading back toward Thomas's homestead, the other continuing toward the larger properties beyond. That's Hargrove's estate, Eleanor said, nodding toward the distant roofline visible through the bare trees. 300 acres, the largest timber mill in the county, and half the town in his debt in one way or another. And the school. Board? He chairs it, Eleanor admitted, but Reverend Collins and Dr. Bennett serve as well, and they're fair-minded men. Thomas knows them both. Maggie stopped walking, turning to face Eleanor directly. I don't want Thomas fighting my battles. He's done enough already. My brother has always had a soft heart, Eleanor said, her voice softening. After Sarah died, I worried he'd never let anyone close again. He buried himself in work, barely spoke for months. She studied Maggie's face. But since you and your children arrived, he's different. I hear him laughing with Henry in the barn. He's carving a doll for Grace. Maggie felt a flutter of something warm and dangerous in her chest. We're temporary guests, she reminded Eleanor, and perhaps herself. Once I secure employment, we'll find our own place. Of course, Eleanor agreed, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Though I will say it's been not unpleasant having children in the house again. Maggie smiled at this grudging admission. High praise indeed, Miss Fletcher. Eleanor sniffed, but her eyes held a hint of amusement. Don't let it go to your head. I still think Samuel's peppermint sticks will rot their teeth. They continued homeward, the tension between them eased by this small moment of understanding. Maggie found herself thinking of Thomas, his quiet strength, the gentleness of his large hands when helping Grace button her coat, the patience in his voice when answering Henry's endless questions. She thought, too, of Lucy, who had begun to watch Thomas with a tentative hope that broke Maggie's heart a little each time she noticed it. Temporary, she reminded herself firmly. They couldn't afford to grow attached, not when their future remained so uncertain. The Pinewood Valley schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple white clapboard building with a bell tower and separate entrances for boys and girls, though this formality was largely ignored by the handful of students who attended. Maggie stood before it early one February morning, her application letter clutched in gloved hands, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. You don't have to do this today, Thomas said beside her. He had insisted on driving her to town, claiming the roads were still too treacherous for her to attempt alone. We could wait until spring, when more positions open. Maggie shook her head. We've imposed on your hospitality long enough. It's not an imposition, he said, quietly. Having you all there, it's been good. For the house, for Ellie, though she'd never admit it. And for you? The question slipped out before Maggie could stop it. Thomas was silent for a moment, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Yes, he finally said. For me too. The schoolhouse door opened, and a slender woman with spectacles perched on her nose emerged. Mrs. Brennan, Reverend Collins is ready for you. Maggie smoothed her dress, her best carefully pressed the night before, and straightened her shoulders. Wish me luck, she said to Thomas. He surprised her by taking her hand briefly, squeezing it once. You don't need luck. Just be yourself. The interview was conducted in the schoolroom itself, with Reverend Collins, Dr. Bennett, and Victor Hargrove seated at the teacher's desk, while Maggie stood before them like a student called to recite. Miss Abernathy, the current assistant teacher, sat nearby, occasionally nodding encouragement. Your credentials are impressive, Reverend Collins admitted, reviewing her letters. 8 years at Millfield Girls Academy is no small accomplishment, and though teaching children of miners and loggers is quite different from instructing young ladies, Hargrove pointed out. Our students require practical knowledge more than poetry and French. I taught arithmetic, geography, and natural sciences. As well, Maggie replied evenly. But I believe all children benefit from literature and languages, regardless of their background. Knowledge expands their world. Dr. Bennett, a kindly man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, nodded approvingly. Well said, Mrs. Brennan, and you have experience with children of different ages. At Millfield, I taught girls from 10 to 16. And of course I have my own children. Lucy is 12, Henry 9, and Grace 6. I've been responsible for their education since my husband's passing. And how would you manage your teaching duties while caring for 3 children? Hargrove asked, his tone suggesting he'd found an insurmountable obstacle. Maggie had anticipated this question. Lucy attends school already and is responsible enough to help with her siblings after hours. During the school day, my youngest 2 would attend classes here. I understand you have several families with multiple children enrolled. And your living situation, Hargrove pressed. A teacher must be above reproach in all aspects of her life. A flush crept up Maggie's neck, but her voice remained steady. Once employed, I intend to secure suitable accommodations for my family in town. On a teacher's salary? Hargrove's eyebrow rose skeptically. With 3 children to feed and clothe? Before Maggie could respond, the door opened and Samuel Wilson entered, looking slightly out of breath. Pardon the interruption, he said, nodding to the board members. I've just received word from Helena. The supply wagon will arrive tomorrow instead of next week. This seemingly irrelevant announcement caused Reverend Collins to check his pocket, watch with a frown. Thank you, Samuel. Is there anything else? Samuel hesitated, then added, I also wanted to inform the board that I have a vacancy above my store, the rooms where my mother lived until her passing last year. 2 bedrooms, kitchen, separate entrance. I'd been planning to rent it come spring, but if Mrs. Brennan is in need of accommodations, I'd be pleased to offer it at a reasonable rate. Maggie stared at him in surprise. Samuel gave her a small wink before addressing the board again. The space would be appropriate for a teacher and her family, I believe. Convenient to both school and church, with the added security of my presence downstairs during business hours. Dr. Bennett beamed. Excellent solution. Thank you, Samuel. Hargrove's mouth tightened, but he merely made a note on his paper. That addresses one concern, at least. After Samuel departed, the questioning continued for another half hour. Maggie outlined her teaching philosophy, demonstrated her knowledge of the standard curriculum, and even solved a complex arithmetic problem Hargrove posed with what she hoped appeared to be effortless ease. One final question, Mrs. Brennan, Reverend Collins said kindly. Why Pinewood Valley? You could likely secure a position in a larger town, perhaps one with more resources, for a woman in your situation. Maggie considered her answer carefully. I came here by chance, she admitted. But in the short time I've been here, I've seen a community that, despite its small size, contains great generosity and strength. The Fletcher family took us in without question. Mr. Wilson just offered us a home without prompting. Even those who've looked at us with suspicion have been honest in their doubts, rather than hiding behind false smiles. She looked each board member in the eye as she continued. I want my children to grow up in a place where people stand by their word, where nature's beauty reminds them daily of something greater than themselves, and where they can learn the value of hard work and community. From what I've seen, Pinewood Valley offers all of that. Reverend Collins smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. We'll deliberate and inform you of our decision by week's end. Thomas was waiting outside, attempting to look as though he hadn't been pacing the length of the schoolyard for the past hour. How was it? He asked as soon as Maggie emerged. Thorough, she replied with a tired smile. Mr. Hargrove was challenging. Thomas's jaw tightened. He can be difficult when he's not getting his way. What way would that be? Thomas hesitated. Victor's daughter, Charlotte, taught here briefly before marrying and moving to Boston. I suspect he had someone specific in mind for this position, someone more aligned with his interests. Well, he made his reservations clear enough, Maggie sighed, but Samuel Wilson offered us rooms above his store, which seemed to satisfy some concerns. Thomas looked surprised, then thoughtful. Samuel's a good man. Those rooms are nice. His mother kept them spotless. They walked toward Thomas's wagon in silence. Maggie was acutely aware of curious eyes watching from shop windows along the main street. Being the subject of such avid speculation was uncomfortable, but she kept her head high. "Will you be disappointed?" Thomas asked suddenly. "If you have to leave our home?" The question caught Maggie off guard. She studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows. "Your home has been a haven," she said carefully. "One I never expected to find, but we can't impose forever." "It's not an imposition," he repeated, more firmly this time. "Thomas," Maggie said gently, "you know as well as I do what people are saying. A widow living under a widower's roof. It's not proper, not without—" She stopped abruptly. Thomas had halted beside the wagon, his expression unreadable. "Not without what, Maggie?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "You know what?" Around them, Pinewood Valley carried on with its daily business. The smithy's hammer rang out. Children laughed as they threw snowballs in the churchyard. Women exchanged recipes and news by the butcher's shop. Ordinary life, continuing as it always had, while Maggie felt as though something momentous hovered just beyond reach. "I do know," Thomas said finally, helping her into the wagon. "And I respect you too much to make this harder than it already is." The ride back to the homestead was quiet, each lost in private thoughts. As they crested the hill that overlooked the Fletcher property, Thomas slowed the horses. "Look," he said softly. Below them, the homestead spread out in the winter sunshine. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and in the yard, Eleanor supervised as Lucy, Henry, and Grace built what appeared to be a family of snow people. Even from this distance, Maggie could hear Grace's delighted laughter as Henry placed a crooked carrot nose on the smallest snow figure. "They're happy here," Thomas observed. "They're adaptable," Maggie corrected, though her heart clenched at the scene. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for." Thomas made a non-committal sound and urged the horses forward. As they approached, Henry spotted them first, waving frantically. "Mama! Thomas! Look what we made! It's a snow family!" Maggie climbed down from the wagon, noting that the tallest snow figure wore what looked suspiciously like one of Thomas's old hats, while the smallest had been wrapped in a scarf Maggie recognized as her own. "A fine-looking family," Thomas commented, his voice carefully neutral, "though I think the father needs a bigger nose." Henry giggled. "That's what Miss Eleanor said, but we ran out of carrots." Eleanor approached, brushing snow from her skirt. "How was the interview?" she asked Maggie in an undertone. "As well as could be expected," Maggie replied. "Mr. Hargrove seems determined to find fault, but Samuel Wilson unexpectedly offered us rooms above his store." A complicated expression crossed Eleanor's face, relief mixed with something like disappointment. "That's convenient," she said finally. "Miss Eleanor helped us with the snow, Mama," Grace announced, tugging at Maggie's skirt. "She showed me how to make snow angels too." Maggie raised an eyebrow at Eleanor, who flushed slightly. The child needed to be shown the proper technique, she said defensively. Her arms weren't making wide enough arcs. Thomas chuckled, and for a moment, standing there in the winter sunlight with the children's laughter surrounding them, Maggie could almost believe they were indeed a family. Not one cobbled together by circumstance and necessity, but one formed By choice and affection, the fantasy was so seductive that she had to force herself to turn away, focusing instead on practical matters. "We should get inside," she said briskly. "It's nearly time for lunch and you all must be freezing." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Maggie sat by the fire mending one of Henry's shirts. The house was quiet except for the occasional pop from the fireplace and the soft scratch of Thomas's pencil as he worked on designs for a new cabinet at the table nearby. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, setting down his pencil, "about Samuel's offer." Maggie looked up, needle poised mid-stitch. "Yes?" Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's generous, but those rooms are small for 4 people. Henry and Grace could share, but Lucy's getting to an age where she needs her own space." "We'll manage," Maggie said, returning to her mending. "We've managed with less." "I don't doubt it," Thomas replied, "but there's another possibility." Something in his tone made Maggie's hands still again. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "What possibility?" she asked, her mouth suddenly dry. Thomas drew a deep breath. "My foreman's cabin is empty. Has been since old Jim retired last fall. It's on my property, just past the apple orchard. 2 proper bedrooms, a good-sized main. Room its own well. Close enough that Henry could still help with the horses. Far enough that..." And he trailed off, then finished. "Far enough that tongues wouldn't wag quite so much." Maggie stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. "You'd rent it to us?" A shadow crossed his face. "I wouldn't take your money, Maggie. I can't accept charity indefinitely, Thomas. It's not charity," he said firmly. He struggled for the right word. "An arrangement. You'd have a proper home for your family. Lucy and Henry could help with chores around the farm. You could take the teaching position without worrying about town gossip. And..." he faltered slightly, "the children wouldn't have to leave a place where they've started to feel secure." Maggie twisted the shirt in her hands, emotions warring within her. The practical part of her mind recognized the sensibility of his offer. The protective mother in her saw the benefits for her children. But another part, the part she'd tried to keep carefully guarded, recognized the danger of becoming even more entangled with this man who had already occupied far too many of her thoughts. "People would still talk," she said finally. "People always talk," Thomas countered. "But they'd have less reason to if you had your own home, your own independence." "And you?" Maggie asked quietly. "What would you gain from this arrangement?" Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "This land, this house, it's been in my family for generations. I built it larger than I needed because I expected to fill it with children. When Sarah died, that dream died too, or I thought it had." He looked around the room, at the evidence of the Brennans' presence. Grace's doll propped in a corner, Henry's drawings tacked to the wall, Lucy's neat stack of borrowed books on the sideboard. "Having your family here has reminded me what this place was meant for," he continued. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Maggie. I'm just offering a way for us both to have what we need right now." Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "And if we stay, and the children grow more attached, and then something changes? I can't risk their hearts like that again, Thomas. They've lost too much already." "I understand. Risk," he said gently. "I've lost too, remember. But sometimes, not taking a chance means losing something before you ever had it." The fire crackled between them, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, an owl called into the night, its cry lonely and clear. "Let me think about it," Maggie said finally. "Please." Thomas nodded, picking up his pencil again. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." They returned to their respective tasks, but the quiet that enveloped them now hummed with unspoken possibilities. Maggie's fingers moved mechanically over her mending, But her mind was far away, weighing choices that felt momentous not just for herself, but for Lucy, Henry, and Grace, children who had already weathered more change than any young heart should have to bear. From the day her husband died in that terrible factory fire, Maggie had made her decisions based on what would keep her family together and safe. She had swallowed pride, worked impossible hours, sacrificed every personal comfort to ensure her children had what they needed. When Gerald Pierce's letters had arrived, offering security and a fresh start, it had seemed like an answer to desperate prayers. Now, presented with Thomas's offer, she found herself wondering for the first time in years what she herself wanted. Not just as a mother, but as a woman. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Across the room, Thomas bent over his drawings, his strong hands moving with precision and purpose. Maggie allowed herself to watch him, to acknowledge the warmth that spread through her whenever he was near. It would be so easy to accept his offer, to imagine a future where their separate wounds might heal together. But easy wasn't always right, and healing couldn't be rushed no matter how badly one wanted the pain to end. Tomorrow, she decided, she would walk to the foreman's cabin and see it for herself. She would consider the practicalities, weigh the benefits against the risks. She would make her decision based on reason and careful thought, not on the dangerous flutter in her chest when Thomas looked at her the way he had tonight. For tonight, though, she allowed herself this quiet moment by the fire, this brief interlude, where possibility hung in the air like a promise and the future, for once, held more hope than fear. The foreman's cabin stood in a clearing just beyond the apple orchard, partially hidden by a stand of pines that shielded it from the main house. Maggie walked the path alone the next morning, her boots crunching through snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the early light. Thomas had offered to accompany her, but she'd declined, needing this moment to herself, to see the place with clear eyes, unclouded by his hopeful presence. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. A woodpile stood neatly stacked against the northern wall, and someone, Thomas, she assumed, had recently cleared the path to the door and swept the porch free of snow. Maggie hesitated at the threshold, oddly aware that this moment felt significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She turned the iron handle and pushed the door open. Inside, morning light streamed through windows that had been recently cleaned, illuminating a space both humble and welcoming. The main room held a stone fireplace with a cooking hook, a solid oak table with 4 chairs, and a rocking chair positioned to catch the best of the daylight. A patchwork quilt hung on. On wall, faded but beautiful, its intricate pattern, speaking of hours of careful work. Maggie moved deeper into the cabin, noting the small but serviceable kitchen area, the shelves stocked with basic provisions, the swept hearth ready for a fire. 2 doors led off the main room. The first opened into a bedroom with a double bed, a chest of drawers, and another window that looked toward the mountains. The second revealed a slightly smaller room with 2 narrow beds and a painted toy chest in one corner. It was this detail that caught in Maggie's throat, the evidence that Thomas had thought of the children, had prepared a space that might feel like their own. She opened the toy chest to find it empty, save for a small wooden horse, its surface smooth from years of handling. A child's treasure, left behind, or perhaps deliberately placed as a welcome. Returning to the main room, Maggie noticed other touches that spoke of careful preparation. A kettle on the stove, a jar of dried wildflowers on the table, a bookshelf with a dozen well-worn volumes. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and solid, and thoughtfully arranged. It could be a home. The thought both comforted and alarmed her. "What do you think?" Maggie turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, a basket on her arm. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her dark hair, making them gleam. "Thomas didn't send me," Eleanor added when Maggie didn't immediately respond. I saw you heading this way and thought you might like some company or information. My brother isn't always forthcoming with practical details. Maggie smiled despite herself. It's lovely, far more than I expected. Eleanor entered, setting her basket on the table. This was meant to be Thomas and Sarah's first home. Before her parents died and left them the main house, Sarah's mother made that quilt as a wedding gift. She nodded toward the patchwork on the wall. I shouldn't, Maggie began, suddenly uncomfortable. It's just cloth and thread, Eleanor interrupted gently. Sarah would have hated seeing it packed away in a trunk. She believed beautiful things should be used, not preserved like relics. Maggie touched the quilt lightly, feeling the careful stitches beneath her fingers. You were close to her. She was the sister I never had, Eleanor confirmed. And after she died, She hesitated, then continued with unexpected honesty. I was determined no one would replace her. In Thomas's life or in mine. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Maggie said quietly. I know that now. Eleanor opened her basket, revealing fresh bread, a jar of preserves, and a packet wrapped in brown paper. I brought a few things to make it feel more like home if you decide to stay. The gesture, so unexpected from the woman who had first regarded Maggie with such suspicion, brought a lump to Maggie's throat. Thank you. Eleanor looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. Well, practical considerations matter. The well is good year-round, though it sometimes needs priming after a hard freeze. The roof was repaired last autumn. The north bedroom gets the morning sun and the chimney draws properly as long as you don't burn green wood. Maggie recognized this for what it was. Eleanor's way of offering acceptance without having to speak the words directly. Those are important things to know, she agreed, matching the other woman's practical tone. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sunlight warming the room around them. He's different when you're here, Eleanor said finally. All of you, I mean, the children especially. Different how? Eleanor considered this, choosing her words carefully. Present. For 3 years after Sarah died, Thomas was like a ghost in his own house. He did what needed doing, spoke when spoken to, but there was nothing behind his eyes, nothing but duty and habit. She looked around the cabin. The day he found you at that station was the first time he made a choice that wasn't about obligation or survival. It was the first time he reached for something. Maggie didn't know how to respond to this revelation. She thought of Thomas, his quiet strength, his patience with Henry, the gentleness in his hands when he helped Grace with her buttons. It was hard to imagine him as the hollow man Eleanor described. And the children? Eleanor continued, smoothing her hand over the table's surface. They've brought life back to a place that was beginning to feel more like a memorial than a home. Lucy organizing the bookshelves that no one has touched in years. Henry asking questions that make Thomas think about things beyond the next harvest. Or lumber shipment, even little Grace singing those silly songs while she helps me with the baking. They're resilient, Maggie said, pride warming her voice. They've had to be. They're more than that, Eleanor corrected. They're healing something in him. Perhaps in me too, though I'd never admit it where Thomas could hear. This last was said with the ghost of a smile. Maggie moved to the window, looking out toward the distant main house, just visible through the trees. I need to be careful, she said softly. For them, they've already lost so much. So has Thomas, Eleanor reminded her. So have you, for that matter. Which is precisely why rushing into anything would be foolish. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Is that what you think this is? Rushing? She gestured around the cabin. Thomas has been preparing this place for weeks, Maggie. A little each day, when he thought no one was paying attention. This isn't impulse, it's hope. The word hung between them, weighted with implication. Hope was dangerous. Hope could be crushed, but without it, what was there? "I should get back," Maggie said finally. "The children will be wondering where." "I've gone." Eleanor nodded, but as Maggie moved toward the door, she added, "Whatever you decide, know that you've already changed things here. For the better." She hesitated, then added with unexpected vulnerability, "I wouldn't mind if those changes continued." The walk back to the main house gave Maggie time to sort through her jumbled thoughts. The cabin offered a solution to their immediate problems. A home of their own, close enough to benefit from Thomas's protection, but separate enough to quiet the gossips. The teaching position, if she secured it, would provide the income they needed for other necessities. It was a practical arrangement, one that any sensible woman in her position would accept gratefully. Yet Maggie knew it was more complicated than that. Living on Thomas's land, seeing him daily, allowing the children to form deeper attachments to him, all of it carried risks that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the heart. She found the children in the barn with Thomas, who was showing Henry how to brush down the bay mare, while Lucy recorded the process in a small notebook she'd taken to carrying. Grace sat on a hay bale, humming to herself as she attempted to braid a piece of rope the way Thomas had shown her. None of them noticed Maggie at first, and she took a moment to simply watch them, Lucy's serious concentration, Henry's eager questions, Grace's contented focus, and Thomas's patient responses. They looked comfortable together, natural, as if they'd known each other far longer than the few weeks that had passed since that snowy night at the train station. Grace spotted her first, abandoning her rope to run to Maggie with outstretched arms. "Mama, Thomas says I can name the new kittens when they're born. The barn cat is going to have babies soon." Maggie scooped her up, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "Is that so? And what names have you chosen?" "Butterscotch and maple and cinnamon," Grace announced proudly. "Thomas says they're good names for orange kittens." "Very sweet names," Maggie agreed, carrying Grace deeper into the barn where the others had now noticed her arrival. "Did you see the cabin, Mama?" Henry asked, barely containing his excitement. "Thomas said it has a special room just for us kids." Maggie glanced at Thomas, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I might have mentioned it," he admitted, "though I told them no decisions had been made." Lucy said nothing, but Maggie recognized the carefully neutral expression her eldest had perfected, the one that hid hope beneath a veneer of pragmatic acceptance. Of all the children, Lucy had been most affected by their precarious circumstances after their father's death, had most keenly felt the burden of uncertainty. "I did see it," Maggie confirmed. "It's very nice." "Can we see it too?" Henry asked, bouncing slightly on his toes. "Please." Maggie hesitated, glancing at Thomas. "Perhaps Mr. Fletcher could show you after your chores are finished, if he's not too busy." "I'd be happy to," Thomas said quietly, his eyes meeting Maggie's with a question in their depths. She gave a small nod, which seemed to both relieve and please him. He turned back to the mare, showing Henry how to check her hooves for stones or debris. Lucy approached Maggie, speaking low so the others wouldn't hear. "Are we really going to live there, Mama?" Maggie brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Would you want to?" Lucy considered this with characteristic seriousness. "It would be better than rooms above a store. Henry needs space to run, and Grace needs somewhere she can be noisy sometimes." She paused, then added carefully, "And it would be nice to stay near the Fletchers. Miss Eleanor is teaching me to make apple dumplings." Maggie raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Is she now?" A hint of a smile touched Lucy's lips. "She says my hands are steadier than yours for crimping the edges." "She's probably right about that," Maggie laughed. She studied her daughter's face, searching for signs of the anxious child who had left Chicago with two old eyes and tense shoulders. The transformation wasn't complete, but there was a softness to Lucy now that had been missing for too long. "I haven't decided yet," Maggie said honestly, "but I'm considering it carefully." Lucy nodded, accepting this. "Mr. Thomas fixed my book," she said, changing the subject. "The one with the torn pages. He showed me how to mend the spine too, so I could do it myself next time." Before Maggie could respond, a call from the house interrupted them. Eleanor stood on the porch, waving. "There's someone here to see you, Maggie," she called. "From the school board!" Maggie's heart leapt into her throat. It had only been a day since her interview. Too soon for a decision, surely, unless they'd already made up their minds before even speaking with her. Thomas straightened, brushing hay from his shirt. "Would you like me to come with you?" The offer was tempting, but Maggie shook her head. "I should do this alone, whatever the news." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Children, let's finish with Maple here, and then I'll show you a special hiding place in the loft where the barn kittens were born last spring." Grace clapped her hands in delight, and even Lucy looked intrigued. Maggie mouthed a thank you to Thomas before setting off toward the house, mentally preparing herself for either outcome. Reverend Collins stood in the Fletcher's parlor, hat in hand, his kind face betraying nothing of his purpose. Eleanor hovered nearby, clearly torn between curiosity and the propriety of giving them privacy. "Mrs. Brennan," the Reverend greeted her warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Not at all," Maggie assured him, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "It's a pleasure to see you again so soon." "I won't keep you in suspense," he said, seeming to sense her anxiety. "The board has reached a decision regarding the teaching position." Maggie clasped her hands tightly to keep them from trembling. "I see. We would like to offer you the position, effective immediately." Relief flooded through her so intensely that for a moment, Maggie feared her knees might give way. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm honored by your confidence." The Reverend smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Miss Abernathy has agreed to stay on through the end of the month to help you settle in. The salary is modest, I'm afraid, $30 monthly, with an increase to $35 after the first year, should your performance meet expectations." It was less than she'd earned at Millfield, but more than enough to support her family with careful management. "The terms are acceptable," Maggie said, trying to keep the emotion from her voice. "When would you like me to begin?" "Monday next, if possible. That would give Miss Abernathy time to introduce you to the students and their families." He hesitated, then added, "I should mention that there was some discussion regarding your living arrangements." Mr. Hargrove expressed concerns. "I understand," Maggie said carefully. "As it happens, I've been offered accommodations that may address those concerns. A separate residence on Mr. Fletcher's property." Reverend Collins's eyebrows rose slightly. "The foreman's cabin?" "Yes, that would be entirely suitable. Close, enough for safety, separate enough for propriety." He smiled. "I'll inform the board at our next meeting. I'm sure it will satisfy any lingering concerns." After he departed, Eleanor appeared with 2 cups of tea, handing one to Maggie without comment. "You heard?" Maggie asked, accepting the cup gratefully. "Every word," Eleanor admitted without a trace of shame. "Congratulations are in order, it seems, for the position and for finding a diplomatic solution to Victor Hargrove's meddling." Maggie sipped her tea, letting the warmth steady her. "I haven't actually agreed to the cabin yet." "But you will," Eleanor stated matter-of-factly. "You're too practical not to." Maggie couldn't help but laugh. "You sound very certain." I am." Eleanor settled into a chair, arranging her skirts with precise movements. "The question is, what happens after that? Once you're established in your position, once the children are settled in school and the town gossip has moved on to fresher targets, what then? I don't follow. Eleanor fixed her with a pointed look. My brother is falling in love with you, Maggie Brennan. Probably has been since he found you at that station, stubborn and proud and putting your children first despite everything. The question is, what do you intend to do about it? You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Eleanor cleared her throat pointedly from across the room. If you two are quite finished, there are 3 very excited children about to wear a path in my floor with their pacing. Thomas laughed, the sound warming the room. We better not keep them waiting then. The walk to the cabin took longer with the children, who stopped to investigate every interesting stone or animal track along the path. Grace insisted on being carried part of the way, ending up on Thomas's shoulders where she issued directions like a tiny general. Left, Thomas. No, the other left. I can see a bird's nest in that tree. Henry darted ahead, then circled back, too excited to maintain a steady pace. Lucy walked beside Maggie, occasionally reaching for her hand when the path grew slippery. As they approached the clearing where the cabin stood, Thomas called for everyone to stop. Close your eyes, he instructed the children. No peeking until I say. Grace giggled as he lifted her down from his shoulders. Henry groaned, but complied, while Lucy raised a skeptical eyebrow before reluctantly closing her eyes as well. Thomas led them forward, one hand lightly on Henry's shoulder to guide him. Maggie followed, curious despite herself about what he had planned. All right, Thomas said when they reached the porch. You can look now. The children opened their eyes, momentarily confused, until Thomas pointed to the side of the cabin where a wooden swing hung from the sturdy branch of an oak tree, its ropes new and seat freshly sanded. A swing! Grace squealed, rushing toward it. I built it yesterday, Thomas explained to Maggie. Thought the children might like having something that's just for fun. Henry was already helping Grace onto the seat, showing her how to hold the ropes. Lucy approached more slowly, touching the smooth wood with careful fingers. Did you make this yourself? She asked Thomas. He nodded. I did. The oak branch is strong enough to hold even me, so it should manage all 3 of you easily enough. Can we really live here, Mama? Henry called over his shoulder as he pushed Grace gently on the swing. Can this really be our house? Maggie looked from her children's hopeful faces to Thomas's carefully neutral expression. She thought of the teaching position waiting for her, of Eleanor's unexpected alliance, of the quiet strength this family had shown in taking in 4 strangers on a snowy night. Yes, she said finally, the decision crystallizing in that moment. Yes, we can make this our home. The joy on her children's faces was worth any uncertainty, any risk. Grace clapped her hands in delight. Henry whooped, and even Lucy smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Thomas said nothing, but the relief and happiness in his expression spoke volumes. He moved to stand beside Maggie as they watched the children take turns on the swing. Thank you, he said quietly. Maggie looked at him in surprise. Shouldn't I be thanking you? He shook his head. You're giving me something I thought I'd lost for good. A sense of purpose beyond just surviving day to day. The sound of children laughing on my land. He hesitated, then added, hope. There it was again. That dangerous, necessary word. Maggie felt something shift and settle in her chest, as if a piece long out of place had finally found its home. We should check the inside, she suggested, needing a moment to compose herself. The children will want to see their room. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of excitement as the children explored every corner of the cabin, claiming spaces and making plans. Lucy immediately gravitated to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines and asking Thomas about each volume. Henry discovered a small workbench in the lean-to at the back and declared it perfect for his inventions. Grace claimed the rocking chair by proclaiming it just the right size for me and Dolly. Thomas showed them the root cellar, the woodshed, and the small garden plot that would be ready for planting come spring. Potatoes grow well here, he explained, and beans. Eleanor has seeds you can use. Maggie watched it all with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. It was everything she could have hoped for when she'd set out from Chicago with 3 children and a letter from a man she'd never met. Yet, it had come from a source she could never have anticipated. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, Maggie called the children to prepare for the walk back to the main house. "When can we move in?" Henry asked, reluctant to leave his newfound kingdom. "Soon," Maggie promised. "We need to gather our things, make sure everything's ready." "I can help bring your trunks over tomorrow," Thomas offered. "There's bedding in the chest in the main bedroom and towels in the kitchen cupboard. Eleanor will likely insist on sending more food than you can possibly eat. I can't wait to tell Miss Abernathy I'm going to live in a cabin in the woods," Henry exclaimed, "just like the pioneers. With considerably more comforts," Maggie noted dryly, but she was smiling. As they walked back toward the main house, Grace tired quickly and reached up for Thomas without hesitation. He swung her onto his shoulders again, where she promptly began a detailed explanation of where each of her dolls would sleep in the new house. Henry ran ahead with boundless energy, occasionally stopping to examine interesting rocks or sticks that might serve his future projects. Lucy walked beside Maggie, unusually quiet even for her. "Are you all right with this decision?" Maggie asked softly, tugging gently on her daughter's braid. "You can tell me if you're not." Lucy considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think it's good," she said finally. "It feels safe here, not just the place, but the people." She glanced ahead to where Thomas was listening intently to Grace's chatter. "He's not like the others, is he? The ones who looked at us like we were a burden after Pa died." Maggie's heart clenched at the reminder of how perceptive her eldest was, how keenly she had felt the judgment of others during their hardest times. "No," she agreed. "He's not like them at all." Lucy nodded, satisfied. "Then I'm all right with staying for as long as we can." The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that Maggie understood perfectly. None of them had dared to think in terms of permanence since the factory fire that took David Brennan's life and their security. With it, "for as long as we can," was the most any of them had allowed themselves to hope for. But as they emerged from the trees to see the Fletcher homestead glowing with lamplight against the gathering dusk, Maggie permitted herself to consider a future, measured not in days or weeks, but in seasons and years. A future where her children grew up with solid ground beneath their feet and people who cared for them nearby. A future that included Thomas Fletcher's steady presence and the unexpected. Family they were beginning to form together. It was too soon to name the feelings taking root in her heart, too soon to make promises beyond those she'd already given. But for the first time since receiving Gerald Pierce's cruel telegram, Maggie felt something unfurl within her, something that felt remarkably like belonging. Eleanor met them at the door, taking in their flushed cheeks and bright eyes with a knowing look. "I take it the cabin met with approval?" she asked dryly. "Thomas built us a swing," Grace announced from her perch on his shoulders. "And I'm going to have a rocking chair just my size." "Is that so?" Eleanor's gaze moved to Maggie, one eyebrow raised in silent question. Maggie nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "It seems we've found our new home." Eleanor's expression softened into something that might almost have been satisfaction. "Well then, I suppose we'd better start planning what you'll need. No doubt my brother has forgotten practical matters like curtains and cooking pots." "I thought of cooking pots," Thomas protested mildly, setting Grace down in the entryway. "There's a full set in the kitchen." "Sarah's wedding pots?" Eleanor asked, her voice unexpectedly gentle. Thomas nodded. "Seemed right they should be used again." A look passed between the siblings, something complex and healing that Maggie couldn't fully decipher but recognized as important. Then Eleanor straightened her shoulders, practical as ever. "Dinner won't make itself," she announced. "Lucy, would you help me set the table? Henry, wash up. You're tracking mud everywhere. Grace, come help me check on the biscuits." The children scattered to their assigned tasks, leaving Maggie and Thomas alone in the entryway. In the lamplight, his eyes were warm and questioning. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Maggie shook her head. "None." "But Thomas..." She hesitated, trying to find the right words for the boundaries they still needed to maintain, the caution that wisdom demanded. He saved her from having to explain. "One step at a time," he said, understanding in his voice. "That's all I'm asking for now." Relief and gratitude washed through her. "Thank you." From the kitchen came the sounds of Eleanor instructing Lucy on the proper way to fold napkins, Henry's exuberant retelling of their cabin adventure, and Grace's sweet voice singing a made-up song about their new home. Ordinary sounds, domestic and precious. "We should join them," Maggie said after a moment. Thomas nodded, but before they moved toward the kitchen, he reached out and briefly, lightly touched her hand. A gesture so simple yet so full of promise that Maggie felt it echo through her like ripples on still water. "Welcome home, Maggie Brennan," he said quietly, and despite all her careful reservations, all her sensible cautions, Maggie found herself believing that perhaps, against all odds, that was exactly what they had found. Spring came to Pinewood Valley in fits and starts, warm days that coaxed, crocuses from the earth, followed by sudden snowfalls that blanketed the new growth. But by mid-April, the transformation was unmistakable. The mountains shed their white caps for verdant green, creeks swelled with snowmelt, and the apple orchard between Thomas's main house and the foreman's cabin erupted in a cloud of pale pink blossoms. Maggie stood at the cabin's front window, early one Saturday morning, watching as bees drifted lazily among the apple blooms. 6 weeks had passed since they'd moved into the cabin. 6 weeks of establishing new routines, settling into the rhythm of teaching at the small schoolhouse, and carefully navigating the complex terrain of their relationship with Thomas and Eleanor. The cabin had become home more quickly than Maggie had dared to hope. Lucy had arranged her books and treasures in the bedroom she shared with Grace, creating a small sanctuary that reflected her orderly nature. Henry had claimed a corner of the main room for his growing collection of inventions, contraptions made from bits of wood, string, and objects found on his explorations of the property. Grace had established herself as the cabin's self-appointed decorator, gathering wildflowers as soon as they appeared and arranging them in jars throughout their home. And Maggie herself had found an unexpected peace in the simple routines of their new life, tending the small garden Thomas had helped her prepare, grading papers by lamplight after the children were asleep, brewing coffee in the mornings as she watched the sun rise over the mountains. The teaching position challenged and fulfilled her in ways she hadn't experienced since before her marriage, and the steady income allowed her to begin rebuilding the security her children deserved. The sound of footsteps on the porch interrupted her reverie. A moment later, a knock at the door announced Eleanor's arrival, basket in hand as usual. "You're up early," Maggie observed, welcoming her in. "The children are still asleep." "Good," Eleanor replied, setting her basket on the table. "I wanted to speak with you alone." Something in her tone caught Maggie's attention. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Thomas received a letter yesterday from Gerald Pierce." Maggie stilled, the name sending an unexpected chill through her despite the morning's warmth. "What did it say?" He's leaving Pinewood Valley, selling his store to Samuel Wilson. Apparently his sister in St. Louis is ill and he's going to assume management of her late husband's interests. Eleanor's precise mimicry of Pierce's formal phrasing would have been amusing under different circumstances. "I see," Maggie said carefully. "That's hardly our concern." Eleanor fixed her with a penetrating look. "Before departing, he's been telling anyone who'll listen that you deceived him, concealed your children deliberately because you were desperate and knew no man would willingly take on such a burden." Anger flashed hot in Maggie's chest. I know it's not true," Eleanor interrupted gently. "But gossip travels fast here. Thomas confronted him at the mercantile yesterday." Alarm replaced anger. "What happened?" "Nothing physical, if that's what you're worried about. My brother has more sense than that, but words were exchanged, rather heated ones by all accounts." Eleanor's mouth twitched slightly. "Samuel says Thomas told Pierce that a man who would abandon a woman and children at a train station in winter wasn't fit to judge anyone's character or intentions." Despite her dismay, Maggie felt a flicker of warmth at Thomas's defense. "That was kind of him." "Kind had little to do with it," Eleanor replied dryly. "He was furious. I haven't seen him that angry since—" She stopped abruptly. "Since when?" Eleanor sighed. "Since we learned Sarah couldn't have children. There was a doctor in Helena who suggested it was somehow her fault. Something about a woman's temperament affecting her ability to conceive. Thomas nearly threw him out the window." Maggie absorbed this, the revelation illuminating yet another facet of the quiet man who had become so central to their lives. "Pierce's opinion doesn't matter," she said finally. "He'll be gone soon, and people will forget." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, "but there's something else you should know. Victor Hargrove was there during the confrontation. He seemed interested in the details of your arrangement with Pierce." Maggie frowned. "Why would he care? Victor always has his reasons, and they're rarely benevolent." Eleanor began unpacking her basket. Fresh bread, a jar of preserves, a packet of tea. "The school board meets next week to review your position at the end of your probationary period." Understanding dawned. "And Hargrove thinks he can use this gossip against me. I wouldn't put it past him." Eleanor arranged the items on the table with precise movements. "Reverend Collins and Dr. Bennett support you, but the board votes as a whole. If Hargrove can sway the others, then I could lose my position." Maggie sat heavily in the rocking chair, mind racing. The teaching job wasn't merely employment. It was independence, security, the foundation upon which she was rebuilding her family's future. "Thomas doesn't know I'm telling you this," Eleanor continued. "He didn't want to worry you, but I thought you should be prepared." Maggie looked up at the woman who had become, against all expectations, something like a friend. "Thank you for the warning and for your discretion." Eleanor nodded briskly. "The school children's spring recital is Tuesday. Most of the town will attend. It might be an opportunity to remind them of your value to the community before the board meets." Before Maggie could respond, the patter of small feet announced Grace's awakening. The child appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, hair-tousled from sleep, clutching her rag doll. "Miss Eleanor," she exclaimed delightedly, "did you bring honey cakes you promised last time?" Eleanor's stern expression softened. "Indeed I did, Miss Grace. But breakfast first, I should think." Grace scrambled onto Eleanor's lap without hesitation, a liberty that would have been unthinkable weeks ago but now seemed perfectly natural. "Can we have our picnic today? You promised that too." "Grace," Maggie began, "Miss Eleanor might have other plans." "Nonsense," Eleanor interrupted. "A promise is a promise, and the weather is perfect for a picnic by the creek." She glanced at Maggie. "Unless you have objections." Maggie recognized the offer beneath the question. A day for the children to enjoy themselves, free from the tension that now clouded Maggie's thoughts. No objections. It sounds lovely. By mid-morning, Henry and Lucy were awake as well, and the plans for the day had expanded to include Thomas, who arrived carrying fishing poles for himself and Henry. Eleanor mentioned a picnic, he explained. Though his eyes held a question as they met Maggie's, she realized Eleanor must have sent word about their conversation, and he was checking if she was all right. A wonderful idea, Maggie confirmed, forcing brightness into her voice. The children have been cooped up all week with their studies. They set off as a group, Eleanor carrying the picnic basket, Thomas with the fishing gear, the children running ahead along the path that led down to the creek where it widened into a calm pool, perfect for fishing and paddling. Maggie walked beside Thomas, close enough to speak privately, but not so close as to invite comment should anyone happen upon them. "Eleanor told you about Pierce," she said quietly. Thomas nodded, his expression darkening. "I should have warned you myself. Would that have included telling me about your confrontation with him?" A faint flush colored his cheeks. "I lost my temper. It wasn't my finest moment." "Thank you," Maggie said simply, "for defending me." His eyes softened. "Always." The simple word, spoken with such certainty, caught at something deep in Maggie's chest. These past weeks, they had maintained a careful distance, friendly, warm, but with clear boundaries. Thomas visited the cabin often, teaching Henry about carpentry, helping Lucy with her more challenging schoolwork, listening to Grace's imaginative stories with unfailing patience. But he never stayed after the children were in bed, never presumed upon their living arrangement, never pushed for more than Maggie was ready to give. Yet in that single word, always, lay a promise Maggie hadn't allowed herself to consider fully until now. "Eleanor mentioned the school board meeting," she said, steering toward safer ground. "She thinks Hargrove might try to use Pierce's gossip against me." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Victor has never forgiven me for buying that eastern parcel when he wanted it for his timber operation. Using you to get at me would be entirely in character." "This isn't about you," Maggie reminded him gently. "It's about my position, my reputation. Our reputations are linked now, whether we like it or not," Thomas pointed out. "The whole town knows you're living on my land, in my cabin, which gives them all the more reason to scrutinize our behavior," Maggie countered. "We need to be careful, Thomas, especially now." He slowed his pace, allowing the others to get further ahead. "Careful," he repeated, a question in his voice. Maggie chose her words with care. "Perhaps we should limit our interactions, just until after the board meeting. Give Hargrove less ammunition." Thomas's expression grew shuttered, a glimpse of the closed-off man Eleanor had described from the years after Sarah's death. "If that's what you think best." "It's not what I want," Maggie admitted softly. "But I need this position, Thomas. My children need the security it provides. I can't risk it, not even for—" She stopped, uncertain how to finish. "For us," Thomas supplied, his voice equally soft. The word hung between them, acknowledging what had been growing these past months, the glances that lingered, the conversations that stretched late into the evening on the cabin's porch, the gravitational pull that seemed to draw them together, despite every sensible reason to maintain distance. "Just until the board meets," Maggie clarified, "just to be safe." Thomas nodded, his expression clearing somewhat. "I understand. I don't like it, but I understand." Ahead of them, Grace's delighted shriek announced their arrival at the creek. The children immediately began exploring, Henry examining the fishing spot with scientific intensity, Lucy testing the water's temperature with cautious fingers, Grace collecting smooth stones from the bank. The day unfolded peacefully despite the morning's tension. Thomas taught Henry the basics of fishing, while Lucy helped Eleanor arrange the picnic on a quilt spread beneath an old cottonwood tree. Grace flitted between groups, collecting treasures and delivering reports of her discoveries with breathless excitement. Maggie found herself watching them all with an ache in her chest. These people who had become so essential to her family's happiness in such a short time. The thought of anything threatening this fragile harmony they'd achieved filled her with a dread that was difficult to suppress. "Penny for your thoughts," Eleanor said, settling beside Maggie on a sun-warmed rock. Maggie forced a smile. "Just enjoying the day." Eleanor's shrewd eyes missed nothing. "He's worried about you, about what Hargrove might do." "I know. My brother is not a demonstrative man," Eleanor continued, keeping her voice low as they watched Thomas showing Henry how to bait a hook. "But when he commits to something or someone, it's absolute." Maggie nodded, unable to find words for the emotions tangling in her chest. "Sarah used to say he loved like the mountains, quiet, solid, unmovable," Eleanor added. She was right about that at least. Before Maggie could respond, Henry's excited shout drew their attention. "I caught one! Thomas, look, I caught a fish!" The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of simple pleasures, a meal shared under open sky, children's laughter echoing across the water, the gentle rhythm of conversation flowing around her. Despite her worries, Maggie found herself relaxing into the moment, storing these memories against whatever challenges lay ahead. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they packed up their belongings and started back toward home. The children, tired from a day of outdoor play, walked more sedately now. Grace rode on Thomas's shoulders, as had become their custom, her head occasionally drooping with fatigue. Eleanor and Lucy walked ahead, deep in conversation about a book. Lucy had recently borrowed from the schoolroom library. Henry trudged beside them, proudly carrying his string of small trout that would become tomorrow's supper. Maggie found herself alone at the rear of their little procession, watching as the golden afternoon light filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across their path. A sense of foreboding nagged at her despite the day's perfection. Or perhaps because of it. Life had taught her that happiness was often fleeting, that security could vanish in a moment's carelessness. Lost in these thoughts, she didn't notice the figure on horseback until he was nearly upon them. Victor Hargrove sat astride his black gelding on the path ahead, forcing their group to halt. "Mrs. Brennan," he called, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "What a charming domestic scene!" Thomas stiffened, carefully lifting Grace from his shoulders and setting her on her feet beside Lucy. "Victor," he acknowledged coolly, "what brings you to this part of the property?" "Just returning from inspecting the eastern ridge," Hargrove replied, his eyes never leaving Maggie. "I'm considering expanding my timber operation. That area has some fine stands of pine." "That's Fletcher land," Thomas stated flatly. "As you well know." "For now," Hargrove agreed with a thin smile. "But circumstances change. Properties change hands." His gaze moved deliberately over the children, then back to Maggie. "Situations evolve." Maggie stepped forward, placing herself between Hargrove and the children. "If you'll excuse us, Mr. Hargrove, it's getting late and the children need their supper." "Of course, Mrs. Brennan." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your arrangement. I merely wanted to inform you that the school board meeting has been moved up. We'll be convening Monday instead of Thursday." Maggie felt her heart sink. 2 days instead of 5 to prepare her defense, to speak with the other board members to ensure her position. "Thank you for the information," she managed. "Don't mention it." Hargrove gathered his reins. "Oh, and Mrs. Brennan, we'll be discussing some concerns that have been raised about your background. I trust you'll be prepared to address them fully." With that, he nudged his horse forward, forcing their group to step aside as he passed. When he was out of earshot, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "Take the children back to the cabin," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I need to speak with Maggie." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Come along, children. Let's get those fish cleaned for tomorrow's supper." As they disappeared around the bend in the path, Thomas turned to Maggie, his expression grave. "He's planning something." "Clearly," Maggie agreed, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Moving the meeting up gives me less time to speak with Reverend Collins or Dr. Bennett. It's not just that." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Maggie had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "That business about the Eastern Ridge, he's threatening to try to take my land. Can he do that? Not legally, but Victor has other methods. The bank in Pinewood Valley holds the mortgage on that parcel, if he can convince them to call in the loan early." Maggie absorbed this new worry on top of her own. "Why now? What does he gain from all this?" Thomas hesitated, then said quietly, "Control. Power. Victor Hargrove has spent 20 years building his empire in this valley. He owns half the businesses, employs a third of the men, and holds notes on most of the rest. The only significant property he doesn't control is mine. And my employment at the school threatens this. How?" Maggie asked, confusion evident in her voice. "It doesn't directly." Thomas's expression was troubled. "But your connection to me does. By attacking you, he pressures me. And right now, you're more vulnerable than I am." The implication hung heavy between them. Maggie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening air. "So I'm a pawn in his game against you?" "Maggie, no." Thomas stepped closer, distress clear in his eyes. "It's the logical conclusion," she interrupted. "My reputation, my position, my children's security, all at risk because of my association with you. Because Victor Hargrove is a calculating, vindictive man," Thomas corrected firmly, "not because of anything you or I have done wrong." Maggie turned away, unable to face the earnestness in his expression. "The outcome is the same." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant call of a whippoorwill and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What do you want to do?" It was the right question, acknowledging her agency, her right to decide her own course. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, weighing options, consequences, responsibilities. "I need to protect my position at the school," she said finally. "It's everything to us. Income, stability, a chance to build something permanent here." "Agreed," Thomas said, though she could hear the tension in his voice. "How do we do that?" Maggie turned back to face him, decision crystallizing into certainty. "I need to speak with Reverend Collins tonight, and possibly Dr. Bennett as well. They need to hear my side before Hargrove can poison them against me." Thomas nodded. "I'll take you into town." "No," Maggie said firmly. "That would only reinforce Hargrove's narrative, that I'm somehow under your influence or protection. I need to go alone." "Maggie, it's nearly evening." "I'll take Eleanor's mare," she interrupted, "and be back before full dark. The children will be fine with you and Eleanor for a few hours." Thomas studied her face, clearly wanting to argue, but recognizing the determination in her expression. "All right," he conceded finally, "but promise me you'll be careful. Victor has allies in town." "I'm always careful," Maggie assured him. "It's how we've survived this long." As they walked back toward the cabin, Maggie's mind raced with preparations. She would need to change into her best dress, gather her teaching credentials and letters of recommendation, and compose the most persuasive case possible for her continuation at the school. What she couldn't prepare for was the ache that had taken up residence beneath her breastbone, the realization that the happiness they'd been building these past months now balanced on a knife's edge, threatened by forces beyond their control. Eleanor, to her credit, asked no questions. When Maggie explained her plan to ride into town immediately, she simply helped Maggie change, gathered the necessary documents, and prepared the mare, while Thomas distracted the children with the task of cleaning Henry's fish. "Samuel Wilson will be closing the store soon," Eleanor advised as she helped Maggie mount. "But if you mention my name, he'll let you in the side entrance. He might have useful information about what Hargrove is planning." Maggie nodded, grateful for the practical suggestion. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." The older woman's expression softened briefly. "Be careful, Maggie. Victor Hargrove plays by different rules than the rest of us." The ride into Pinewood Valley took less time than Maggie had anticipated, her urgency lending speed to the mare's steady trot. The town was quiet as she approached. Most businesses already closed for the evening. Light still shone from the windows of the church, however, and from the back of Samuel Wilson's mercantile. Maggie tied the mare to a hitching post near the mercantile's side entrance and knocked softly on the door. After a moment, Samuel's weathered face appeared in the gap. "Mrs. Brennan?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Is everything all right?" "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Maggie said. "Eleanor suggested I might speak with you." Samuel immediately opened the door wider. "Never a disturbance. Come in. Come in." The back room of the mercantile was warm and cluttered, with crates and barrels waiting to be unpacked. Samuel cleared a space on a bench and offered Maggie a seat. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his kind eyes concerned. Maggie explained the situation succinctly. Pierce's gossip, Hargrove's unexpected appearance, the school board meeting, moved suddenly forward. Samuel's expression grew increasingly troubled as she spoke. "I feared something like this might happen," he admitted when she had finished. "Gerald came into the store yesterday, making insinuations about your character to anyone who would listen. When Thomas confronted him, Victor seemed almost pleased by the exchange, as if he'd been waiting for it," Maggie surmised. "Exactly so." Samuel rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "And now he's moved the board meeting up, giving you little time to prepare your defense." "Do you know what specific accusations I might face?" Maggie asked. "I need to be prepared for whatever Hargrove might claim." Samuel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "There's been talk, suggestions that you misrepresented yourself to Gerald deliberately, that you might have done the same to Thomas." Maggie's stomach clenched. "That's absurd. Thomas found us at the station after Pierce had already abandoned us." "I know that," Samuel assured her. "Most folks with sense know it too, but Victor has been planting seeds of doubt, suggesting that perhaps you and Thomas had some prior arrangement, that the whole situation with Pierce was a fabrication to provide cover for impropriety." Heat flooded Maggie's face. "That's outrageous. I never even knew Thomas Fletcher existed until that night at the station." "As I said, those with sense know better," Samuel said gently. "But school teachers are held to a higher standard, especially women. Even the suggestion of impropriety can be damaging." Maggie fought to control her indignation. "What should I do?" Samuel considered this carefully. "Reverend Collins is your strongest ally on the board. He's at the church now, preparing tomorrow's sermon. I'd speak with him first, present your credentials, remind him of your excellent work these past weeks." "And Dr. Bennett?" "Attending a birth out at the Peterson farm, I'm afraid. Not expected back until morning." Maggie nodded, formulating her strategy. "Thank you, Samuel. You've been more than kind." "One more thing," Samuel said as she rose to leave. "Gerald Pierce came to me yesterday to finalize the sale of his store. He mentioned something that might interest you. Said he'd received a letter of inquiry about you several weeks before you arrived in Pinewood Valley." Maggie frowned. "From whom?" "He wouldn't say." but it seemed to influence his decision to reject your arrangement so abruptly, almost as if someone had deliberately poisoned him against you before you even arrived. A chill ran down Maggie's spine. You think Hargrove was behind that as well? Samuel spread his hands. I can't say for certain, but Victor has always liked to control who settles in Pinewood Valley. A strong-willed woman with 3 children and a teaching background would represent an independent element he couldn't easily manipulate. This new information swirled in Maggie's mind as she made her way to the church. If Samuel was right, Hargrove's campaign against her had begun before she even set foot in Pinewood Valley, not because of her connection to Thomas, but because of what she herself represented. The realization was both disturbing and oddly empowering. This wasn't merely about her relationship with Thomas. It was about her right to establish herself in this community on her own terms. The church was quiet as Maggie entered, a single lamp burning near the pulpit where Reverend Collins sat reviewing his notes. He looked up at her approach, surprise giving way to a warm smile. Mrs. Brennan, he greeted her. What a pleasant surprise. What brings you to church on a Saturday evening? Maggie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. I need to speak with you about the school board meeting and about some rumors you may have heard regarding my character. The Reverend's expression grew serious. I see. Please sit down. He gestured to the pew nearest his pulpit. Tell me everything. As the evening shadows lengthened outside the church windows, Maggie laid out her case, her qualifications, her work with the children, her true circumstances. Upon arriving in Pinewood Valley, she showed him her credentials and letters of recommendation, explained the situation with Pierce honestly and completely, and finally shared her concerns about Hargrove's motivations. Reverend Collins listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but otherwise allowing her to speak without interruption. When she had finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mrs. Brennan, he said finally, in my 20 years as pastor of this church, I have learned to distinguish between genuine character and manufactured scandal. Your work with our children speaks volumes more than any gossip ever could. Relief washed through Maggie. Thank you, Reverend. That said, he continued, his expression grave, Victor Hargrove wields considerable influence in Pinewood Valley. The other board members, particularly Mr. Jensen and Mr. Holloway, have business dealings with him that might sway their votes. What can I do? Maggie asked, determination replacing relief. Reverend Collins considered this. The children's spring recital is Tuesday afternoon. Every parent in town will be there, along with most of the board members. It would be an opportunity to demonstrate your value to the community before the vote. Eleanor suggested the same, Maggie acknowledged, but the meeting is now scheduled. For Monday? The Reverend's eyebrows rose. Monday, that's irregular. Board meetings are always on Thursdays. Mr. Hargrove informed me of the change this afternoon. Understanding dawned in the Reverend's eyes. I see. Well then, we shall have to be more direct. He stood, gathering his papers decisively. Mrs. Brennan, would you be willing to visit several homes with me tomorrow morning? Specifically the homes of Mr. Jensen and Mr. Holloway. Maggie blinked, surprised by the suggestion. Of course, but sometimes the most effective strategy is the most straightforward, Reverend Collins explained with a small smile. I believe if Mr. Jensen and Mr. Holloway have the opportunity to speak with you directly, to see the dedication you bring to our children's education, they might be less susceptible to Mr. Hargrove's influence. Hope kindled in Maggie's chest. I would be grateful for the opportunity. Excellent. The Reverend checked his pocket watch. It's growing late. May I escort you home? I'd be happy to bring the buggy around. Thank you, but I have Eleanor's mare, Maggie replied, rising. I should return quickly. The children will be waiting." As she prepared to leave, Reverend Collins placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Mrs. Brennan, if I may offer some pastoral advice." Victor Hargrove thrives on isolation, on making his opponents feel alone and vulnerable. Remember that you have allies in Pinewood Valley, more than you might realize. Maggie nodded, throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Reverend. I'll remember that." The ride back to the cabin seemed both longer and shorter than the journey into town, longer for the weight of all she had learned, shorter for the urgency of returning to her children. As the mare crested the final hill, Maggie could see lamplight glowing from the cabin windows, warm and welcoming in the gathering darkness. Thomas sat on the porch steps, clearly waiting for her return. He rose as she approached, moving to help her dismount with strong, gentle hands. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice low to avoid waking the children. Maggie leaned against the mare for a moment, suddenly exhausted. "Better than I feared. Worse than I hoped. Reverend Collins will support me, but Hargrove has influence with the other board members." Thomas's face was shadowed in the dim light, but she could read the tension in his posture. "What's our next step?" The simple inclusion, "our" instead of "your," nearly undid her composure. "Reverend Collins is taking me to meet with Jensen and Holloway tomorrow morning, to make my case directly." Thomas nodded, relief evident in his shoulders. "That's good. Collins carries weight in this community." "Samuel thinks Hargrove may have been working against me before I even arrived," Maggie added, explaining what the shopkeeper had shared. "That this isn't just about my connection to you, but about controlling who becomes part of the community." "That sounds like Victor," Thomas agreed grimly, "all the more reason to stand firm." They walked toward the cabin in silence, the mare following docilely behind. At the steps, Maggie paused, looking up at Thomas in the soft glow spilling from the windows. "I was wrong earlier," she said quietly, "about keeping distance between us. If Hargrove is determined to target me regardless, there's no point in pretending there's nothing between us." Thomas's expression softened, hope lighting his eyes. "Maggie, I'm not saying we should be reckless," she clarified quickly. "But I won't let fear of his judgment dictate how we live our lives either." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and gently covered her hand with his own. "Whatever happens with the school board, with Hargrove's schemes, we'll face it together, that's all I ask." Maggie turned her hand beneath his, threading their fingers together in a gesture that felt both monumental and entirely natural. "Together," she agreed. Inside the cabin, she could hear Grace's soft snores, Henry's occasional mumble in his sleep, the quiet creak of floorboards as Lucy shifted in her bed. All the treasures of her world, safe and secure, because of the man standing before her, and the unlikely family they had begun to build together. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Maggie knew with sudden certainty that she would not face them alone. And that knowledge gave her a strength she hadn't felt since David's death, the strength that comes not from solitary endurance, but from being truly, deeply connected to others. "You should rest," Thomas said softly, reluctantly releasing her hand. "Tomorrow will be challenging." Maggie nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "Good night, Thomas." As she stepped through the cabin door, she turned back one last time. "Thank you for everything." His smile in the lamplight held all the warmth and promise of home. "Always," he replied, the single word carrying all they had yet to say to each other. Maggie closed the door softly behind her, moving quietly to check on her sleeping children. Lucy's arm was thrown protectively over Grace, while Henry had somehow managed to twist his blankets into an impressive knot around his legs. As she straightened their covers and pressed gentle kisses to their foreheads, Maggie found her determination hardening into resolve. These children deserved the stability and happiness they had begun to find in Pinewood Valley. She would not allow Hargrove or anyone else to take that from them, not without fighting with every ounce of strength and intelligence she possessed. Tomorrow, she would meet with the board members alongside Reverend Collins. She would present her case calmly and clearly, demonstrating through her dignity and professionalism exactly why she was the right person to teach Pinewood Valley's children. And if Hargrove insisted on making this a battle, he would discover what Maggie had learned through years of adversity, that a mother protecting her children's future was a force more formidable than any amount of money or influence could overcome. With that thought firmly in mind, Maggie prepared for bed, her mind already mapping strategies for the challenges that lay ahead. As sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was of Thomas, of the quiet strength in his hands, the unwavering support in his eyes, and the promise of always that lingered in the air between them like a vow waiting to be fulfilled. Monday dawned crisp and clear, the Montana sky stretching endless blue above Pinewood Valley. Maggie stood before the small mirror in the cabin's bedroom, smoothing the front of her best dress, navy blue with a white collar, simple but dignified. Her hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, and she wore the small pearl earrings. That had been her mother's, the only piece of jewelry she hadn't sold during the difficult months after David's death. Sunday had passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Reverend Collins had been true to his word, escorting Maggie to the homes of both Mr. Jensen and Mr. Holloway. The meetings had gone better than she'd dared hope. Jensen, a cattle rancher with 3 school-aged children, had been particularly impressed by Maggie's detailed knowledge of his youngest daughter's progress in arithmetic. Holloway, though more reserved, had nodded approvingly when she outlined her plans for expanding the school's science curriculum to include more practical applications for farming and ranching communities. "You look perfect," Lucy said from the doorway, her serious eyes taking in every detail of her mother's appearance, like a real teacher. Maggie smiled, turning from the mirror to cup her daughter's cheek. "I am a real teacher, sweetheart. Today, I just need to remind the board of that fact." Lucy nodded solemnly. "Henry wanted me to tell you he's keeping his fingers crossed all day, even during penmanship." "That's very dedicated of him," Maggie laughed, gathering her documents into a leather folder Thomas had given her for the occasion. A knock at the cabin door announced Eleanor's arrival. She had offered to stay with Grace, who was too young for a full day of school, while Maggie attended the board meeting. "Ready?" Eleanor asked briskly, though her eyes held unusual warmth as they swept over Maggie's appearance. "As I'll ever be," Maggie replied, squaring her shoulders. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Thomas is bringing the wagon around. He insisted on driving you to town himself." "I expected nothing less," Maggie said softly. Outside, Thomas waited by the wagon, his expression brightening as Maggie emerged from the cabin. He had dressed in his Sunday best, a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and the hat that he saved for special occasions. "You didn't need to dress up," Maggie observed as he helped her into the wagon. "Yes," he replied simply, "I did." The ride to town passed mostly in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts as the wagon rolled through the awakening countryside. Spring had fully established itself now. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, new leaves unfurled on every branch, and birdsong filled the air with complex melodies. As they approached the outskirts of Pinewood Valley, Thomas finally spoke. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know something." Maggie turned to him, noting the unusual intensity in his profile. "Yes? These past months, since that night at the station, they've been a gift I never expected to receive." He kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the reins. "You and the children have brought life back to a place that had forgotten what living felt like." Emotion tightened Maggie's throat. "Thomas, "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know we've been careful, practical, and that was right. For the children, for your position, for all the sensible reasons that matter. But if today doesn't go the way we hope, if Hargrove succeeds in his schemes, I need you to know that the cabin is yours for as long as you want it. That my support isn't conditional on anything. That whatever comes next, you won't face it alone." Maggie reached across the space between them, laying her hand on his arm. "I know," she said simply, the words carrying all the weight of trust and gratitude she couldn't fully express. They had reached the main street now, the wagon's wheels clattering on the wooden bridge that crossed the creek at the edge of town. People moved about their morning business, many nodding in greeting, as Thomas and Maggie passed. Samuel Wilson stood outside his store, sweeping the boardwalk. He paused to tip his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Fletcher, fine morning." "Indeed it is, Samuel," Thomas agreed, reining the horses to a stop. "Any word about the meeting?" Samuel glanced around before stepping closer to the wagon. "They're already gathering at the schoolhouse. Hargrove arrived early with Jensen and Holloway." Maggie's heart sank slightly. She had hoped her visits yesterday had made a positive impression on the two men, but if they were already in conference with Hargrove... "Don't look so worried," Samuel added with a small smile. "Dr. Bennett returned from the Peterson farm this morning and went straight to join them. And Reverend Collins has been at the school since dawn, making sure everything is in proper order for your defense." "Thank you, Samuel," Maggie said, drawing strength from the shopkeeper's clear support. As they approached the schoolhouse, Maggie could see several horses and a fine buggy, Hargrove's undoubtedly, tied at the hitching posts outside. Thomas brought the wagon to a stop a respectful distance away. "Would you like me to come in with you?" he asked quietly. Maggie considered this carefully. Having Thomas beside her would provide comfort and strength, but it might also feed into Hargrove's narrative of impropriety or dependence. "I think I need to face this on my own," she decided finally. "But knowing you're nearby helps more than I can say." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. He helped her down from the wagon, holding her hand for perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I'll wait in Samuel's store. Just send word when it's done." Maggie nodded, gathering her courage along with her folder of documents. As she walked toward the schoolhouse door, she felt Thomas's gaze following her like a physical touch, steady, supportive, unwavering. Inside, the 5 members of the school board sat at a table arranged at the front of the classroom. Victor Hargrove occupied the center position, flanked by Jensen and Holloway on one side, Reverend Collins and Dr. Bennett on the other. The room's usual arrangement had been altered. The teacher's desk positioned directly before the board's table, like a defendant's stand before a jury. "Mrs. Brennan," Hargrove greeted her, his tone formally cordial, though his eyes remained cold. "Thank you for joining us promptly. I believe you understand why this special session has been called." Maggie took her place behind the desk, setting her folder down with deliberate calm. "I understand the board reviews teaching positions at the end of probationary periods," she replied evenly, "though I admit the sudden rescheduling was unexpected." "Certain concerns were raised that required immediate attention," Hargrove countered smoothly. "Concerns about your background and qualifications. I'm happy to address any questions the board might have," Maggie said, opening her folder. "I've brought my complete credentials and letters of recommendation." Yes, Hargrove waved a dismissive hand. "We've seen those. The question before us today concerns more personal matters. Specifically, your arrangement with Gerald Pierce and your subsequent residence on Thomas Fletcher's property." Reverend Collins cleared his throat pointedly. "I believe, Mr. Hargrove, that we agreed to focus today's discussion on Mrs. Brennan's performance as a teacher." "A teacher's character is inseparable from her performance," Hargrove replied. The children of Pinewood Valley deserve an instructress of unimpeachable moral standing. Dr. Bennett, a stocky man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, leaned forward. Then let us examine the facts. Mrs. Brennan has increased attendance at the school by 15% since her arrival. My own son, who previously claimed illness every other day to avoid arithmetic lessons, now eagerly completes his studies. Academic progress is certainly important, Hargrove acknowledged with calculated reasonableness. But consider the example being set. A woman arriving under questionable circumstances, taking up residence on a bachelor's property. If I may address that directly, Maggie interrupted, her voice firm despite the hammering of her heart. I came to Pinewood Valley at the invitation of Gerald Pierce, who had advertised for a wife, but failed to mention he would not accept a woman with children. When he abandoned us at the station, Mr. Fletcher offered shelter during a dangerous snowstorm, an act of Christian charity that anyone in this community would have extended to children in need. Her gaze moved deliberately from face to face around the table. As for my current residence, I maintain a separate household in the foreman's cabin, supporting my family through my teaching salary. There has been no impropriety, only the practical. Assistance one neighbor might offer another in a frontier community where cooperation often means the difference between survival and tragedy. A moment of silence followed her words. Jensen and Holloway exchanged glances, while Reverend Collins nodded slightly in approval. Hargrove, however, was not so easily deflected. Gerald Pierce tells a different story. He claims you deliberately concealed your children in your correspondence, attempting to trap him into a marriage he never would have agreed to otherwise. Mr. Pierce is welcome to his interpretation, Maggie replied, struggling to keep her voice level. But my letters to him, which he is free to produce if he wishes, made clear that I sought a home for my family. If he failed to inquire about the composition of that family, the oversight was his. Dr. Bennett made a sound that might have been a hastily disguised chuckle. Well said, Mrs. Brennan. Hargrove's expression hardened slightly. The question remains, can this community trust the education of its children to a woman whose personal circumstances are, at best, unusual? If I may, Reverend Collins interjected, I visited the homes of several students yesterday. The Henderson family reports their daughter's reading has improved remarkably under Mrs. Brennan's tutelage. The Williams boy, who previously refused to attend school at all, now arrives early each day to help Mrs. Brennan prepare the classroom. And my Josephine, Jensen added unexpectedly, wrote her first complete sentence last week. Mrs. Brennan gave her a gold star and had her read. It aloud to the whole class. His weathered face softened with fatherly pride. She couldn't stop talking about it all weekend. Hargrove frowned, clearly displeased by this support. Nevertheless, appearances matter in a position of public trust. The arrangement with Fletcher is none of our concern, Dr. Bennett interrupted firmly, unless it affects her teaching, which all evidence suggests it does not. A knock at the classroom door interrupted the proceedings. Samuel Wilson entered, looking slightly apologetic but determined. Pardon the intrusion, he said, but I believe the board should see this before concluding its deliberations. He approached the table, holding out a telegram. Hargrove took it with obvious reluctance. This is highly irregular, Wilson. So is this entire proceeding, Samuel replied evenly. That telegram arrived for Gerald Pierce 3 days before Mrs. Brennan came to Pinewood Valley. He left it behind in his desk when selling me the store. I discovered it only this morning while taking inventory. Hargrove scanned the telegram, his face darkening. Reverend Collins leaned over to read it as well, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Would you care to explain this, Victor? The Reverend asked quietly. Hargrove's jaw tightened. It's a private business matter. It appears to be instructions to Gerald Pierce to reject any arrangement with Mrs. Brennan, regardless of her qualifications, Reverend Collins observed, his voice deceptively mild. Signed with your initials. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Maggie stared at Hargrove, pieces falling into place with sudden clarity. Her arrival had been doomed from the start, not because of her children or her circumstances, but because Hargrove had determined it should be so. I was merely advising a business associate, Hargrove said stiffly. Pierce was considering a hasty arrangement that might have affected his standing in the community. Or perhaps, Dr. Bennett suggested, you were eliminating a potential obstacle to your plans for Fletcher's eastern parcel. A respectable teacher with 3 children establishing herself in Pinewood Valley would strengthen Fletcher's position considerably. Hargrove's expression confirmed the accusation without a word. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the board members. Jensen and Holloway exchanged troubled glances, their loyalty to Hargrove visibly wavering in the face of such calculated manipulation. I move we conclude this review, Reverend Collins said into the silence, and affirm Mrs. Brennan's position as permanent teacher at Pinewood Valley School, effective immediately. Seconded, Dr. Bennett agreed promptly. All in favor? Reverend Collins looked around the table. Jensen raised his hand without hesitation. After a brief pause, Holloway followed suit. Dr. Bennett's hand was already up, as was the Reverend's. Only Hargrove remained opposed, his expression tight with controlled. Enger, the motion carries, Reverend Collins announced. Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan. The position is yours for as long as you wish to hold it. Relief washed through Maggie so powerfully that for a moment she feared her legs might give way. Thank you, she managed. I promise to serve this community's children with all the dedication and skill I possess. Hargrove stood abruptly, gathering his papers. This meeting is adjourned, he announced, his voice clipped. Without looking at Maggie, he strode from the classroom, the door closing firmly behind him. The remaining board members approached Maggie with congratulations and handshakes. Jensen invited her to Sunday dinner to meet his wife. Holloway, still reserved but clearly satisfied with the outcome, mentioned that his oldest daughter might benefit from additional reading assignments of the sort Maggie had instituted. As they departed, Samuel lingered. I thought you might want to deliver the news to Thomas yourself, he said with a small smile. He's been pacing the length of my store for the past hour. Maggie laughed, the sound light with relief and happiness. Thank you, Samuel, for everything. Outside, the spring sunshine seemed brighter somehow, the air sweeter. Maggie walked toward the mercantile with steps that felt buoyant despite her exhaustion. Through the store window, she could see Thomas arranging fishing lures with far more concentration than the task required, his way of keeping his hands busy while his mind was elsewhere. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. Thomas looked up, his expression cautiously hopeful as he took in her face. It's done, Maggie said simply. The position is mine, permanently. Joy spread across his features, transforming them. In 3 long strides, he crossed the store and stood before her, carefully restraining himself from the embrace they both clearly wanted. Hargrove? He asked. Overplayed his hand, Maggie explained. Samuel found evidence he had arranged my rejection before I ever arrived. Thomas shook his head, amazed. So it's over. You're staying. We're staying, Maggie corrected softly. My family? In Pinewood Valley, in the cabin, if that offer still stands? Always, Thomas replied. The word weighted with all the promise it had held before. They stood there in the quiet of the store, the future opening before them like the vast Montana sky, bright with possibility, rich with hope, and anchored in the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside on the boardwalk, Lucy and Henry appeared, released early from their classes to hear the board's decision. Behind them, Eleanor approached with Grace perched on her hip. The little girl clutching a bouquet of wildflowers clearly meant as either celebration or consolation. "Mama!" Henry called, spotting her through the window. "Did they say yes? Are you still our teacher?" Maggie turned to Thomas, her heart full. "I think our family is waiting for us," she said softly. His smile deepened, understanding all she hadn't said aloud. Then we shouldn't keep them waiting any longer. Together, they stepped into the sunshine to share the news with the children who had brought them together, the unexpected family that had formed from adversity, second chances, and the courage to hope again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.